You have just been given what may be the most intimidating assignment in the history of live rock music. You are going to play drums for Rush. Specifically, you are going to learn 40 songs from the catalog of Neil Peart, the man so widely considered the greatest rock drummer who ever lived that his death in 2020 made international news for days. You are not a Rush fan, you knew a few of the big songs before this started. You are a jazz fusion drummer from Germany who built her following on YouTube, and you are about to spend 6 months with your entire life turned over to the task of internalizing the most scrutinized drum parts in the history of progressive rock. You get into the rehearsal room, you start working through the catalog, song by song, week by week. You develop a completely new approach to preparation, no sheet music, everything memorized by heart, because you have realized that these parts cannot be written out in a way that captures what they actually are. You have to feel them. And then the day comes when Rush asks you to play Tom Sawyer. You stop. You look at the kit. You look at Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. And you say 3 words. Yikes, I'm not sure I want to play this one. This is the story of that moment, what it tells us about Neil Peart, what it tells us about Anika Nilles, and what it tells us about what it actually takes to step into a role that most musicians, if they're being honest, would never dare to accept. Tom Sawyer was released in 1981 on Rush's Moving Pictures album. It was, and remains, the song most casual listeners associate with Rush, the one they know even if they've never bought a Rush record. The one that has been in soundtracks and television shows and video games and sports broadcasts for 40 years. But the reason Anika Nilles stopped dead when it was time to play it is not the song's fame. Fame is manageable. The reason she stopped is what's actually happening in the drum part. Tom Sawyer is built on a rhythmic feel that is, on the surface, relatively straightforward. It's not a 7/8 time signature with a shifting polyrhythm. It doesn't have the structural complexity of La Via Strangiato or the sweet architecture of 2112. What it has is something harder to imitate, a specific, unmistakable, absolutely perfect groove that Peart inhabited so completely over decades of performing that any deviation from it, any difference in feel, any note landed at a slightly different weight or position, is immediately audible to anyone who knows the song. Geddy Lee described it precisely in his account of the moment. The fills, he said, were not the hard part. Nilles could play those. Any elite drummer can learn a fill. What was hard was the feel. Sitting in the specific groove that Tom Sawyer has. Finding the exact spot in the pocket that Peart occupied for 40 years and settling into it with your own body, your own hands, your own relationship with the instrument. That is a completely different challenge from technical mastery. You can practice a fill until it's perfect. You cannot practice a feel, you have to find it. And finding it requires understanding not just what Peart played, but why he played it that way, what his musical personality was. How he thought, what drove his choices. This is the problem that made Anika Nilles say yikes. Here is what Nilles figured out early in the preparation process. You cannot learn Neil Peart by reading Neil Peart. She tried using written notation at first, the standard approach for a professional musician learning an unfamiliar repertoire. And she ran into a problem that she has described clearly in her own words. Peart's parts cannot really be written out. They can be notated, sulls, pitch and rhythm and dynamics can be captured on a page, but what makes them work, what makes them Peart, is something that notation cannot hold. It is, as she said, a feeling. So she made a decision that was unusual, and in retrospect exactly right. She would learn everything by heart, no sheet music on the kit, no notation to refer back to. She would absorb the catalog the way a musician absorbs language, T-sec, not through translation, but through immersion, until the thing lived in her body rather than just in her head. She watched live shows, not to copy what Peart did on stage but to understand how he thought in real time. She watched the footage that exists of him talking about drumming, Marbre, the interviews, the documentaries, the moments when he explained his own musical logic in his own words. She studied the way he approached the kit physically, the specific posture and hand technique and relationship to the instrument that produced the particular tonal qualities she was trying to capture. She has described what she found, and it is one of the most interesting musician-on-musician analyses in recent memory. She said Peart had a very melodic approach to drumming, which sounds like a compliment but is actually a specific technical observation. He used the drums as a melodic instrument, not just a rhythmic one. He had a wide range of tonal colors, the sounds produced by hitting different parts of a drum or cymbal at different angles, and with different force, choose a voice with the same intentionality a guitarist uses when choosing which string to bend and how far. She noted his ride cymbal specifically. His relationship with that single cymbal, to particular sound it produced in his hands, the specific way he would drive a song forward with it, was, she said, immediately recognizable. You knew it was him the moment you heard it. You recognize him immediately, she said. And she decided that if she was going to honor him properly, she needed to understand why. Not just what the notes were. Why this note and not that one? Why this feel and not that one? Why the ride cymbal sounded the way it sounded and not some other way? That is the preparation that preceded the yikes moment. 6 months of it. Geddy Lee's account of the Tom Sawyer moment is worth sitting with, because he told it in a way that reveals a lot about how the band handled the anxieties of this whole process. She said yikes and stopped. And Lee and Lifeson didn't push her through it. They didn't say just play it, you'll be fine. They talked through it. They worked through it together. They tried to give her the specific context, the way the song felt to them from the inside, what it was like to play alongside Peart on that particular track for 40 years, that might help her find the entry point she was looking for. And then she played it. And the fills were, as Lee noted, not the hard part. She could play those. What took time was the feel. Finding where the groove was, settling into it, letting the song's specific internal logic become her own, rather than something she was trying to replicate from the outside. Lee has described the moment when it clicked as one of the most rewarding things he experienced in the entire preparation process. He said, "When all the tumblers fall into place, and she gets the vibe, and we're just playing and smiling, it's like, this is going to be so much fun." That image Lee, Lifeson, and Nilles smiling at each other in a rehearsal room in Canada because Tom Sawyer has finally clicked, is somehow one of the most genuinely joyful details in the entire comeback story. The hardest song, the one that made her stop and say she wasn't sure she wanted to play it, and then it clicked, and they smiled. Here is something that has barely been discussed despite being one of the most revealing things Geddy Lee has said in any interview about the comeback. In a late February 2026 interview with The Guardian, to known Ife, about 6 weeks before the Juno Awards debut, months before the Kia Forum opening night, to Chao Jurate, Lee admitted that in the early days of rehearsals with Nilles, there was a moment when he thought it was not going to work. Not just, I had some doubts, he thought it wasn't going to work. He did not elaborate extensively on what that moment looked like or what specifically wasn't connecting. What he said was that they had already gotten on the same page in less than a week, which means the moment of doubt and the resolution of that doubt were compressed into roughly a week in a rehearsal room in Canada. This admission matters for 2 reasons. First, it makes the Day 5 breakthrough, moment that Lifeson described where she just nailed it, song after song, even more meaningful. Lee wasn't watching a musician he was already confident in finally deliver on promise, he was watching someone solve a problem he wasn't sure was solvable. Second, it reframes Nilles' own yikes moment when facing Tom Sawyer. She and Lee were, at different points in the process, both genuinely uncertain. Both of them faced the same question from different sides. Is this actually going to work? She brought her doubt to the kit and said it out loud. He carried his privately and didn't share it publicly until months later. And both of them got to the same place. Yes, it works. Let's go. There is something deeply human in that symmetry. 2 musicians, neither of them sure, figuring it out together in a room in Canada, until the fills were there, and the feel was there, and the smiles were there, and the only thing left to do was book the Kia Forum. The Anika Nilles preparation story is interesting to Rush fans and drumming enthusiasts for obvious reasons. But I think it is interesting to a much wider audience for a reason that has nothing to do with progressive rock. What Nilles did in those 6 months, the specific way she approached an assignment that was, by any reasonable assessment, too daunting for most professionals to accept, is a masterclass in how to learn something that cannot be learned in the conventional way. She identified, early and correctly, that notation was insufficient, that the thing she was trying to learn was not fully capturable in written form. And she made the decision to change her entire methodology based on that recognition. She chose immersion over analysis. She chose feeling over notation. She chose to understand the person behind the parts rather than just copying the parts themselves. And then, when she hit the wall, when Tom Sawyer made her stop and say yikes, she didn't push through alone. She told the truth about where she was. She said, I'm not sure I want to play this, and Lee and Lifeson talked her through it, and they worked through it together, and she found the feel. That is, stripped of all the rock and roll mythology, what most hard things actually require. The recognition that the conventional approach won't work. The willingness to change the method when the method fails. The honesty to say yikes out loud when you're not ready. And the patience to work through it with the people around you until the tumblers fall into place. She clued in now, Lee said. Really lovely to see. There is a very famous piece of Peart mythology that I want to bring into this conversation because I think it's the most fitting way to close. Neil Peart described himself, for most of his career, as a student of drumming. Not a master, not an authority. A student, someone who was always finding new things to learn, new techniques to explore, new ways of approaching the instrument that had defined his entire adult life. Late in his career, he began studying with Freddie Gruber, a jazz drumming educator whose approach emphasized feel over technique, natural movement over mechanical precision. Peart was in his 40s, one of the most respected drummers in the world, and he was essentially starting over with a teacher who told him his grip was wrong and his posture was wrong and he needed to relearn the foundations. He did it. He rebuilt his entire approach, because he was a student. Anika Nilles, facing Tom Sawyer in a rehearsal room in Canada, did the same thing. She had been a professional for 20 years, she had toured with Jeff Beck, she had 4 albums and a YouTube channel, and festival appearances, and a reputation in the drumming world built on 2 decades of serious work. And she stopped, looked at the kit, and said, "Yikes, I don't know if I want to play this one." That moment, the honesty of it, the humility of it, the willingness to be uncertain in front of the 2 people she most needed to impress, is, I think, a very Neil Peart thing to do. He would have understood it. Drop a comment, what's your favorite Neil Peart drum moment? And do you think Tom Sawyer is the hardest part in the Rush catalog, or is there something worse? Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.